So today for the Homesteading Academy, our lunchtime webinar, we have Sandra Grenchi, who is with the Family and Community Health Sciences Department at Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Hunterdon County. She's been an educator there since 2006. She's currently a registered dietitian nutritionist, a certified diabetes care and education specialist, and a trained mindful eating instructor. Sandra focuses her community outreach on diabetes and chronic disease prevention, also food safety and home food preservation. And she's also the coordinator for the FCHS Master Food Preserver Program. So she's an excellent person to lead off this type of presentation. And Sandra has brought a special guest with her, her colleague, Cindy Schlenker-Davies, who is a now recently retired associate professor at New Mexico State University, where she was formerly a member of the Department of Family and Consumer Sciences. Cindy worked there with Cooperative Extension Service, where she was a Family and Community Sciences agent, also Program County Director in Bernalillo County in New Mexico. She focused, similar to Sandra, on food safety, food preservation, and preparation, where it was important for her to educate the community on safe canning practices and pressure canning. With 17 years experience from Cindy, and I'm sure similar experience for Sandra. So we're sure to learn a lot from the two of them today. They're going to split their time in this presentation. We ask that you post your questions in the chat, and we will hope to have time at the end for any question and answers. So Sandra, why don't you take it away?
Okay, Kate. Well, thank you so much for that great introduction. And I just want to say that in the typical cooperative extension fashion, when I invited Cindy to co-present, she is a wealth of information and knowledge, in particular about this topic, which really is kind of new in the interest area in New Jersey, but out where Cindy comes from, out in New Mexico, I mean, canning meats and game meat and pressure canning, soups and chilies and things like that. It's a huge topic, and Cindy has tons of really great practical experience. So she is here today, and we're going to take full advantage of her. But I'll get us started. So what we plan to do is a little basic review about food safety, because food safety is integral to the entire process of preserving food at home, but even at the very beginning steps of kitchen sanitation and hand washing, for example. And in the event that this might be your very first webinar or class on food preservation at all, we do want to review the difference between water bath canning and pressure canning, so you understand the difference. And Cindy will give us lots of details about the operation of pressure canners. She's going to give us a great overview of the safe and tested methods for pressure canning meat, fish, and seafood. And we hope we'll have enough time. I'm sure there will be many questions. We hope to be here to be able to answer as many as we can. So we decided to put this up front, this slide about the importance of using tested, safe, and reputable resources when you're doing food preservation. We were chatting before the webinar began, and really due to the accessibility of online social media sources, and really the whole explosion of that during the pandemic, many new canners, people new to canning are going to less than safe resources. They don't really know why they're not safe, but we are certainly all about safety and cooperative extension and tested methods. So we have a list here of some of our go-to resources. The first one is the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. And the latest edition or revision is 2015. We wish that was more updated, but that's available on the second site, which is the National Center for Home Food Preservation. It's actually a link on that site. And the National Center is really our go-to source in extension for tested recipes and methods. Think of it as the hub of information for extension educators and consumers who are doing safe food preservation at home. And fortunately, there's been an influx of some funding to that center so that there's some studies that are hopefully ongoing, updating some methods, adding some new methods, updating this next bullet, which is a really great resource, so easy to preserve, is think of it as a cookbook / resource compilation that was available at the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension. Right now, I don't see it being available for sale. We understand it is being updated, but you can check on keep checking back like I do on the National Center for Home Food Preservation page, and hopefully it will be back available soon. Here at Rutgers, our department, Family and Community Health Sciences, does have a page for home food preservation and food safety, and the link is there. And we have a lot of webinars that we produced during the pandemic on all kinds of topics in home food preservation. So if you love this, go to that page and you'll see webinars on canning fruits and vegetables, dehydrating, everything that we did during the pandemic and then even after. And I included Cindy's wonderful resource here from her cooperative extension office back in New Mexico. And once again, there are so many good extension sources of safe information on home food preservation. And we also have a slide later on that has some great videos for you to check out. Okay, so as I was saying, food safety and sanitation begins at every step of the process for preserving food at home. And that really includes basic sanitation in your kitchen. So follow effective hand washing and surface cleaning and sanitizing at the beginning and throughout the process that you will be doing in your home kitchen. In particular, when we're talking about working with meats and seafood, making sure that you don't cross-contaminate things in your kitchen, dedicate a cutting board, a sanitized cutting board for dealing with your meats. I added the last bullet Cindy had, wear gloves when handling chilies, but I figured you wouldn't know what we meant by that in New Jersey, so I expanded that to be hot peppers. Okay, so for those of you that might be very, very new, this slide really tries to show you the two main methods for preserving foods at home. Hopefully you viewed my last webinar I did on water bath canning. So on the left, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but we have a enamel pot that we can use for water bath canning. And what Cindy's going to be talking about over here is one of the various types of pressure canners. So water bath canning, quick review, we use this for foods that are high acid foods. Now, we don't expect anybody to be taking out pH paper at home and testing their foods. That's the value of using a tested recipe and a tested method. It will tell you which type of process you will need to do based on the characteristics of the food. But in general, we're going to be doing, I have another slide that'll show a little more info, acid foods that are lower risk generally for microbial contamination compared to the foods that we would do in a pressure canner, like what we're doing today, meats, seafoods, those kinds of foods. So the low acid, or think basic on that pH scale, the basic foods, the issue, why we need to do this is really, really important. So when we're processing foods in a water bath canner, the highest temperature that we can reach with boiling water, if you remember your chemistry or physics, is 212 degrees. But there are some very resistant spores of a microorganism that is infamous, Clostridium botulinum, and we cannot kill those spores at 212 degrees. So we have to be able to achieve a higher temperature, and we can only do that under pressure. So that's why we would select a pressure canner for those classes of foods, that the low acid foods that would pose a higher risk for botulism. And why are we worried about botulism? Because when we're preserving foods in a glass jar that is going to be stored at room temperature, we're creating essentially an ideal environment for that particular microorganism to proliferate. They love no air. We're driving the air out of our jars. They love low acid substrate. That's the type of food we'd be dealing with here. They love moisture. We're going to have moisture. And they love sitting out at room temperature. And we're really creating the ideal environment for them. So we need to destroy those microorganisms and their resistant spores. And we can do that if we follow the proper method in a pressure canner. So let's start with the acid foods really quick. Generally, all fruits. Certain fruits, we have to actually add a little more acid because they are not acidic enough, either because of modern varieties or better testing and new research. And that's why we always need to use the latest tested methods. So we lump tomatoes, figs, Asian pears into this group of all fruits, but we have to give them an extra boost of acidity by adding either citric acid or bottled lemon juice when we're canning them. So that whole group can be water bath canned. Fermented foods, for example, sauerkraut, we are going to be creating organic acids that will lower the pH. Those can be safely water bath canned. And then foods that we add a large amount of acid, such as pickles, I mean, their vinegar is our acid. So these foods are safe to can in a water bath canner. And then the opposite would be the foods that we'll be talking about today. So the low acid foods, pH is higher than this cutoff point. But remember, you're not going to be using pH paper at home. You're just going to be following tested methods. And this is where we lump all the other vegetables that wouldn't be pickled, right? So if you are a big gardener and like me, you grow a lot of green beans and people in your house like to eat them canned, don't forget that part, you would need a pressure canner to just can up those green beans. And then the meats and poultry, seafood, absolutely in this category. Soups, so we're going to be making a mixture. There could be meat in there. There'll be a lot of these low acid vegetables. They would be pressure canned. And then this one applies in New Jersey. I see this one a lot. Tomato sauces. So if we're canning up plain tomato sauce and we acidify it, we can use our water bath canner. But when we like to make those combination sauces, so we want to add peppers, or we want to add onions, or we want to add meat in there, then we have now created a mixture, and that has to be pressure canned. And there are tested recipes for all of these different foods. Okay, Cindy, I'm going to hand it over to you with this slide, and just let me know when you want me to advance.
Okay. So just talking about the basic equipment for pressure canning, over the years, I have seen many different canners come into the office. Cooperative Extension has the availability to test a dial gauge canner. So if you need to have your dial gauge tested, you can check with your Cooperative Extension agent, or
I have one in my office.
So Sandra, you can contact Sandra if you need that done. But it's important to get that dial gauge tested every few years. If you pull grandma's canner out from the attic and it hadn't been looked at in 30 years, you really want to make sure that you're safe in this. So you want to get that tested. Most likely you will have to replace your dial gauge, but those are fairly easy to replace. So your equipment is very important. In canning, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but you do need to use proper glass jars, proper canning lids and screw bands. Having a good jar lifter so you're not burning yourself obviously is important. Current safe canning recommendations is always key. And as Sandra mentioned, approved recipes. Next, Sandra. So this is just an illustration, and any canning book you have will have something similar to this. It just talks about all the different components of a pressure canner. A pressure canner can be a dial gauge or a weighted gauge, and a weighted gauge works quite nice in your low elevation. In New Mexico, weighted gauges aren't always preferred because of our high elevation. We need higher pressure sometimes than the 15-pound weighted gauge can provide, but where you're at, that should be great for you. So it talks about the safety valves, the safety plugs, all of the things that are part of a pressure canner that when safely used, you do not have fear about doing this process. Many people, and probably some of you, have stories of improperly used or poor equipment in your pressure canner or pressure cookers who have blown on you or have caused an explosion or whatever. So pressure canning is a scary thing for a lot of people just because they don't have the proper equipment or don't know how to use it. So it really is quite safe. It really is pretty easy, and it's not something you should fear, but you do need to do it correctly. Next, Sandra. So pressure canners, the last several years, multi-cookers or Instapots, as they're often known, have come into our world, and they are wonderful for many things. They are not meant to be a pressure canner. And some of the pressure cookers, multi-pot cookers, will even talk about the pressure canning availability that they have. Usually they are too small for the process. As Sandra has written here about the size, they need to be able to at least hold 4 quart jars. And a quart jar is a fairly good sized jar, and most of them will hold 3 or 4 pint jars. So that's one factor. Another factor is the pounds of pressure. And again, in the lower elevation, it's not quite as big a deal, but pounds of pressure is set on those multi-cookers so they don't get above 11 pounds pressure. And if you are above 3,000 feet in altitude or elevation, 11 pounds pressure is not enough to pressure can in. So that is very important, but we will not be able to recommend that you use your multi-cooker for pressure canning for these various reasons, and they're all listed here for you to go back and review. A few words about an electric digital pressure canner. I actually own one of these and have used it. We cannot recommend it because USDA has not totally certified this piece of equipment. We do expect that they will. I think they're just backlogged from all that happened with their loss of funding and during the pandemic. But there are electric pressure canners on the market. Presto has one. And they really, if these turn out to be what all of us hope they will be, it's a very safe and easy way to pressure can. So stay tuned. We're hoping and have our fingers crossed that this will be on the market for everybody to enjoy soon, and we can give the approval of it. Sandra, do you have anything to say on this?
I just wanted to add that they can be used as a water bath canner, like as I bought the
Yeah,
of the
that's true.
Presto models. And essentially you can water bath can in any pot as long as you are meeting the, following a method, a tested method for water bath canning. So they can be used for that.
Right.
But it's the pressure canning function that hasn't been third party tested, and that's what we're waiting for. So I'm very excited because I have one that I really I'm going to be playing around with it anyway to get to know it. I got it for my birthday. But I'm really excited if these take off.
Yeah. Right. So in the meantime, we have the couple different varieties of canners. If you have a very old canner that does not have all the safety plugs and vents and so forth on them, I would suggest that you update your pressure canning equipment, because in the 1970s, USDA did put out some guidelines as to what makes a safe pressure canner. So I've had many people bring in their grandmother or great grandmother's pressure canner saying, can I use this? And in all honesty, it might make a lovely pot holder or plant holder, but you really should not be using the very old canners because they do not have the safety equipment on them. So to can or not to can, this is something that we run into quite a bit with people that are wanting to can things like canned pumpkin or canned mashed potatoes or something that's super dense. And with pressure canning, the heat needs to be able to go back and forth through the food and bring all of it up to that very hot temperature. So you need to pay attention to what the regulations say about foods that are able to can and not to can. Things like thickeners or flour, rice, noodles, pasta of different kinds. A lot of times the recommendation, well, pretty much all the times, the recommendation is to not can those. And most of it, honestly, is they will just, when you're pressure canning something at 240 degrees, you're cooking the heck out of it. So if you're cooking pasta for an hour with your soup, you're not going to have any pasta left. You're just going to have mush. So it's important that you follow those regulations, and you can always add your thickener after the fact when you go to serve your soup up or whatever, or add your pasta, your noodles. So make sure and use tested recipes, not only for safety, but also for quality. And a lot of the things you'll find online, the quality is very diminished by the time you go through their process.
Yeah, actually, Cindy, I was going to add just what you said there, that these tested recipes are the ones, either Ball's tested recipes or the National Center, USDA. Even though food safety is paramount, they also are very interested in the final product being a good product. So they balance both.
Right.
And like you said, you don't want to go through this entire process and expense and end up with a really poor product.
Right.
So
Correct.
it is important to understand that the tested recipes do look at both.
Right. And I don't know how well you're going to be able to see all this, but this is a can of pinto beans that I pressure canned. And in New Mexico, of course, New Mexican food is very popular. And pinto beans are grown here, and we eat them all the time as a staple food. So a lot of pinto beans are canned. And even though this is a very dense product, you use really more liquid than you do beans in it. So when it is pressure canned, it does have a good flow of liquid going around the beans, and they will swell and expand like they do when you cook beans. And so you can find directions for this kind of thing. And if you don't have pinto beans, black beans, navy beans, anything else, along that line will also go for this. But so when we're talking about something super dense, it's important that you follow regulations on the amount of liquid in there, so it's not so dense that that heat can't penetrate through it. All right, next one. Mhm. So altitude or elevation and altitude are what determines the time on pressure canning. In New Mexico, I'm in Albuquerque at 5,000 feet above sea level, and our water boils at 204 degrees because of our high elevation. So it makes a difference in water bath canning on the amount of the length of time that we can something. We can it for longer because of our lower boiling temperature. But in pressure canning, we have to can things according to pounds of pressure. And so in our higher elevation, most things are canned at about 15 pounds pressure, 13 to 15 pounds. And in Sandra wrote out different elevations in New Jersey and where the highest points are in New Jersey. And 1,800 feet in Sussex County isn't even going to make the chart on when to be concerned about high elevation. But most things probably are between 10 and 11 pounds pressure is what I would assume, right, Sandra?
Yep.
Okay.
So, but if you do live in one of those areas, I had to do a little research on that, and you may not live on the peak, obviously, of the area, but do know your elevation if you're in any of these counties.
Yeah. Okay. Now, it's important in pressure canning that you allow the venting process to happen. With pressure canning, with water bath canning, you cover your jars completely and you're boiling them with water over the jars. In pressure canning, you've got 2 or 3 inches of water on the bottom of the canner with a rack on the bottom so it doesn't touch the burner directly. Your jars, you would crack them if you touched them directly on the heat source. But as you heat up your canner, you will see in this slide that there's steam coming out, and that's called the venting process. And you need that steam to vent out of the canner before this woman is going to cap it off with a weighted gauge. So the pressure will rise to what she needs it to safely can the product that she's got. So the venting process is a 10-minute process. You don't want to cut this short. You want to vent it completely. And you will even start seeing it kind of losing steam as it gets closer to the 10 minutes to know that your pressure canner is ready for you to seal it tight and let the canning process start.
So Cindy, on this, it's important that we want steam to be in this canner. We don't want pockets of air, right? So that's
Correct.
We are getting rid of all the air and filling with steam. Yep.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And it's actually a steam process that is cooking your food. Yeah.
Right. Oh, I just said, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah, there you
go.
Yeah. So pretty much what we just said. Some canners, pressure canners, have a weighted gauge that goes on top of it, like the last slide. Some have what's called a petcock, which is actually a little pipe that you, once it's finished venting, you fold it over to lock the heat in. And that is not as commonly seen in newer pressure canners, but in many pressure canners over the last 30 years, that Pepcot thing is what has been used as their venting pipe. So just so you know, there's several different versions of pressure canners.
Yep.
So we mentioned placing the weight over the vent port to or close the petcock to start the process. And then you have to make sure that the gauge especially if you're talking about a dial gauge, reaches what it needs to before you start timing the process. And once you reach with your weighted gauge that, say, 13 pounds pressure, if that's what your recipe calls for, then you need to make sure that it holds that throughout the time. And this is why pressure canning is not something you can just set it and go and do your thing. In another hour, come back and you should be fine. If your temperatures vary at all, you really have to start the whole process over. So you want to make sure that your gauge, if it's set for 10 pounds, doesn't go up to 15 pounds and then down to 5 pounds. You need it to keep it within a couple pounds variance for food safety purposes.
You know, Cindy, this may be a good slide to talk about the different type of stove tops, because I don't know that we
Okay.
have a slide
Okay.
on that, but this is the point, I think.
Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, there are a lot of stove tops that are not good for pressure canning. And I have talked to many a canner who's been very upset that they've had a glass grillware kind of stovetop, and the heaviness of the pressure canner with jars of food and water in it on a very high temperature for a very long period of time will often cause that stovetop, that glass stovetop, to crack. And I've even seen people's stove that's collapsed in, and
Wow.
it is a horrible mess, to say the
Oh,
least.
boy.
And hot. But so the stovetops, gas is preferred if you've got a gas option. Recently at my office, we purchased an induction single unit that we can plug in, and Presto makes an induction pressure canner, so we can can safely on that induction heater. So that's a nice option if you do have a glass stovetop and you want to pressure can. You're not going to be able to change to a gas stove, then the induction burner is a good way to go. A lot of the West, people will can outside in a propane burner, and especially in places where they're fishing, say in Alaska or right on a coast, they are fishing, canning it right there. So that is also an option, but you need to make sure that your heat source stays steady. Another reason that the glass stovetops don't always work for pressure canning, in addition to the weight, is they pulse heat, and
Yes.
so it goes on and off and on and off. And with pressure canning, you need it to be steady all the way through for that long processing time.
Well, I can certainly speak to that. I had to actually, if any of you out there that do have the glass top stove, even for water bath canning, check with the stove manufacturer to make sure that you can accommodate the size of your canner on your largest burner, because it can't exceed the size, the diameter of your burner by a couple of inches. It depends on your stove and your burner size, and obviously your pot. But not all glass top stoves are even rated for water bath canning, because of what Cindy just mentioned. You can't keep the heat consistent enough to maintain a rapid boil for a long period of time. So, and the weight, of course, on the glass top stove. So definitely, if you've never done it, check with your manufacturer even on that part. And my stove, unfortunately, was not rated for pressure canning. So that hence why I am really hopeful that the digital canners will get approved.
Yeah, for sure. Another thing that I didn't mention is when you are canning and you reach your pressure level, you are very, very soon going to have to start turning back your heat to get it to hold at that. Otherwise, it will shoot over, and that can be a danger zone for you, where the pressure builds up so much that you have some kind of an explosion. And all of the dial gauges will have a thing, caution warning on when it gets to a very high level. But in most stoves, I have found you're going to go to back to medium or medium low heat to hold it at that pressure level. Once it builds up inside that canner, it tends to hold it right there. So, but you do want to pay attention to your dial gauge. If it's a weighted gauge, usually you can tell by the sound of the pressure gauge, but the dial gauge is a little easier to determine that way by just reading the numbers. So,
And bottom line, it's a do not walk away from your
Right.
canner situation.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about pressure canning meat. Meat is something that we can quite a bit in the West because we tend to have a lot of meat. Beef, for sure, and we have a lot of hunting. So we have elk, antelope, different venison, different game is hunted here. And before you pressure can it, you need to skin it, debone it, cut the gristle and fat off, and cut it into size pieces that are used for jarring. You can can in either a hot pack or a raw pack method. Raw pack meaning you fill your jars with the raw meat, and the hot pack meaning you do some browning or cooking before you fill your jars. So it's kind of your choice and whatever recipe you're following. But some meat honestly looks better if you brown it a little bit before canning. And if there's anything that's a turnoff for most people with canning meat is the way it looks. It's kind of a light pink, murky color. And usually I think canning is just lovely. A can of peaches or pickles or green beans, it's very pretty. But canned meat, you cannot say so much about it. So browning meat is not necessary for pressure canning purposes. After you have pressure canned the meat for as long as is required, you have got a very, very tender piece of meat. So it's going to literally fall apart on you when you're using it. So you don't need to cook it ahead of time. Little, if any, liquid is used or needed in most, especially raw pack canning. I'm going to show you a jar. This is a quart jar of pressure canned pork. And you will see that there is some fat on the top. That's what floats on the top. We did not add any extra liquid on this. There's a lot of liquid in this jar from just the meat itself when it was canned. So even though we tried to cut off all the fat we could see, when you can meat, you will inevitably have some fat on that. So let me talk about my chicken. This was a experiment that I did, was requested by a couple people in my county. They wanted to see if they could can the Costco chicken. That was only $5 a chicken. So that was a good deal. They wanted to see if they could can it. So I bought 2 Costco chickens and I got 4 pints of meat out of each chicken. And of course, the chickens are cooked, right? They're roasted chickens. So I just literally pulled the chicken off, put a little broth in there because it had already been cooked, so it's not going to give up much more juice. And chicken is not quite as juicy as some of your other meats. But I canned my chicken, and what I did with the bones of the chicken is I boiled it down to make my own beef chicken broth. And if you're going to can meat, you might as well also plan on canning the broth, because like any good cook, you're going to go through a lot of broth over the time. And with this broth, I think it may be in the next slide or so too, but just to, while I'm thinking about it, if I had made the broth drained off all of the vegetables that I used, the spices that I used, and so forth, and then chilled the broth, I could have scraped the layer of fat off the top before I canned it. I did not wait for it to cool down and scrape that off, which is why I have a little bit of fat on it. Not a lot, because chicken doesn't have a lot of fat, but canned broth is a wonderful thing to have along with your meat. So, and just a little show and tell. Here's some meatballs that I canned. These are pork and beef combo, and they are just in a beef broth. So we brown them quickly just for color purposes, and then we can the meatballs in here. They are quite nice, and you can use them, of course, in any dish that you would require meatballs. Here's a can of stew or jar of stew that I did. It's got beef in it, potatoes, onions, carrots, all of the things of stew. And this is nice to have on hand. I know your group does a lot of homesteading kind of things, so you probably like to preserve food so you can have them on hand. Stew is a good one to do that. Sandra, can you click to the next? Oh, I guess you did.
You know, I just wanted to add one thing, or maybe you can make this point. So if our viewers are wondering, all right, so how do you know you had that idea about canning meatballs? So how do you know what method to use? So they're not going to conjure up a method, correct? Right. They're going to go and find.
Yes, you can go to a USDA approved recipe or publication from Cooperative Extension. You may not have that publication in New Jersey, but you might have it in Montana or North Carolina, or so you can kind of Google it and look for a USDA publication from a land grant university on canning meatballs or whatever. So it is possible to find those. The Ball Company also has good recipes for pressure canning that you can use. So you can find those. This one is, if it might be a little hard for you to see, but this is actually taco meat that I canned. And you can see there's quite a bit of fat on the meat still, and we browned it first, we drained it, but there was just still so much fat within the taco meat that when we canned it, all of the fat rose to the top. Of course, what will happen when I use this, I'll just take off that layer of fat, and my meat itself will be pretty lean. So you do want to get off as much fat as you can on your meat. And this is why you will not see recommendations from USDA on how to can bacon or how to can sausage or something that's a really high fatty meat anyway. Because what happens is the fat will, as it cooks, it will go up the sides of the jar, and it can cause your seal to not hold because the fat is under that seal. So that's one of the reasons that either canning with a lot of oil or fat is not recommended, or using a real fatty piece of meat is not recommended. Your seal will be affected, and cosmetically it looks pretty nasty. So that's kind of the purpose of that. You can certainly add your garlic, onions, seasoning into your meat, so you can make it kind of your own. Pressure canning does allow that, whereas water bath canning, you have to really tightly follow those recipes. When you're pressure canning, you can add things as you want, making your soups using different vegetables and so forth. Yeah. But always use a USDA guiding guidelines on how to do this. And you will be surprised how long it takes. If you have ever pressure canned, it is not at all uncommon for a recipe to call for, well, the pork 1 hour and 20 minutes or 120 minutes, or So a really long time, 2 hours is not uncommon. And then with pressure canning, after you've canned it, then you turn off your power, and your pressure has to go all the way down before you're able to take it out of the canner. So that is a really another part of a long process. So you're not going to just wake up and think I'm going to pressure can in an hour. No, it's going to take you 8 or 6. So yeah.
And some logistical planning.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, we have some great videos on one of our slides that you guys can go and watch that really is the next best thing to coming to one of Cindy's hands-on classes.
Which you may have to travel a few miles if you live in New Jersey. So I mentioned the bone broth and how I like to use that. You can also make vegetable stock if you are not wanting to use meat. But your stocks are a nice thing to can and have available for yourself. And it's easy to find recipes on and doing your stocks, using your stocks. Now, fish is the next thing that we're going to talk about. And there is actually a food science specialist in Maryland who's doing quite a bit of research on seafood and canning seafood. And her name is Shauna Henley. And I think over the next few years, she's been working with USDA, the National Center, to get some recipes for seafood and seafood stews and like clam chowders and those kinds of things. So pay attention to that. You will see some of those recipes coming forth. And depending, of course, where you live and what you have access to is what you would want to be canning. And so there are recipes and instructions for how to can clams, crab, fish of all kinds, oysters, so on and so forth. But you do want to pay attention to best practices. There's a good video on how to can. This woman's actually canning salmon, but it's good for just canning almost any kind of fish. And the link for that, Sandra's got included.
Yeah, I have that. That was really good. Cindy, while we're on this topic, I mean, I can't say that I have ever wanted, because this is one of the longest processing times.
Yes.
For fish.
Yes.
It's 2 hours, I think, or close to.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How does the quality for some of these folks from across the country who are doing a lot of this, what do they say about the quality of the product when they're done with? I mean, fish is so tender and
lovely and fresh. Yeah.
Yeah. So how does that work?
If you're only cooking a scallop for 5 minutes before you eat it, and you're thinking about canning scallops that you have to can them for 2 hours, you can imagine what's going to happen to the scallop, right? It's going to be turned into mush. Or you think of canned salmon or canned tuna fish. Those all are become really quite mushy. And so a lot of people, when they're canning, decide that that's really not what they prefer. They don't enjoy the quality of it. So that has to be considered in all of this. I have a very good friend who lives in Alaska and she's canned things that you wouldn't even believe you could can, but she has a publication on canning walrus meat because that's what they have. And that's what their people eat. So how do you do that safely? And so when you're doing something like walrus or seal, you're canning it for so long, you just can't believe that you have to cook something for that long. But you really do for food safety purposes. So I think that's one of the things that Shauna and the National Center are working on is, yes, you can, but what is realistic and what is good quality after all is said and done. So that'll be interesting to see what they.
Very good consideration. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So along with the meat, when you're canning fish, you really have to clean it up good before you're ready to stick it in your jars. So you need to get all the guts out, you need to cut the head off, you need to bleed it out, all those things that are not for the squeamish if you're not used to working with fish or meat. But if you do have a good source of fish or seafood of some kind, there's only so much room in a freezer, right? And then you need to do something else with it. And a lot of people dry or smoke their fish, but canning is another option. So you need to take all the precautions beforehand to safely can it. All right. So follow the processing time. Yeah, this is kind of just repeating ourselves, but it's usually in smaller jars for a lot of the like shrimp and crab and that kind of thing, rather than the big quart jars. Pint jars do take less time, require less time, but you know, follow what you've got, your directions.
That may be the longest processing time I've ever seen.
2 hours and 40 minutes.
Yeah.
At 240 degrees.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of cooking. So they must really be concerned about the food safety, getting all the botulism spores or whatever other spores might be in there. So yeah, probably not for everybody, right?
Well, good to know that you have
Right.
to understand the entire process.
Right. And some extension sites across the country have some excellent resources. Again, if you just even Google cooperative extension publications on canning fish or canning whatever meat or whatever you're after, you will get a good variety of resources available to you. And then this University of Carolina, North Carolina is a fun video on canning.
Yeah, that was good.
Two home economists together are kind of working on this, and it's just fun. But you can also find some good YouTubes on this. There's also a lot of not so reliable YouTube videos on canning everything, but especially pressure canning meat and so forth. So you want to make sure you know what your resource is.
You know what, while we're on that topic, when I was trying to find the cooperative extension videos, it is amazing how few or how hard it was to find those, but how many non-evidence-based sources on canning meats and seafood came up. Many of them around homesteading too. I'm not saying that they were all not following an evidence-based method, but there were so many. Start with an extension resource, or ball if you have if you want to use a commercial source.
Right. And to their credit, many of the videos and information do use USDA materials. You just want to make sure that what you're listening to isn't somebody's great idea or how their grandmother did it, 80 years ago kind of thing. So we want you to be safe.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, so it's important to label and date all of your jars. I just take a marker and write on the top of my jars the date and what it is. Chicken canned in 2023. So I will be able to quickly use it, and I keep my older stuff up front, so I make sure and use my canned goods within a year is for the best quality. It will last longer than that, but quality does diminish after time, so you need to be careful of that. Troubleshooting your canned goods. Siphoning does happen if you improperly pressure can things and you try to speed up the process. You try to take the gauge off before it's completely down to 0 on your dial gauge. The liquid will literally siphon out of your jars. And I've seen many, many jars over the years where people try to rush it, and that's what happens. So it's important to just use all of the proper steps. Make sure that you're using enough liquid. In most canned vegetables, most people are not using enough liquid. And it looks like that at the time, but as things kind of expand, you'll see that they don't have enough liquid on top. This is not something that you probably will ever need or see in your state, but this is canned green chili, which is our #1 food that we can in New Mexico. And it is very important to do that with pressure canning, because most people who have canned that over the years have water bath canned. And we've had more people die of improperly canned green chili because of botulism than any other food. So not a statistic that's going to happen in New Jersey, but I'm sure you do have some foods that are more dangerous.
Well, let's not do it with tomatoes.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And then after you've got all of your food canned, you can label it, take the rims off, store it nicely, and you are ready to go for the year. You've got lovely food to work with. Okay, so you want to hit the summary, Sandra?
Okay, yeah. Well, we've discussed all the important safety features of not only pressure canning, but also a reminder on water bath canning, the importance of following tested, safe recipes from reputable sources. Cindy did a quick overview of pressure canning, the importance of altitude. So if you're going to be in any high spots, just remember that. All the main points about processing meats, combination foods like soups and stews, seafood, we covered that, and safely storing your canned goods. And overall, hoping and really desiring to create a quality product that you can consume in a reasonable time without food waste, because that's so important. That's a big consideration. That's why we're doing food preservation, so we don't waste it. Right. So, so with that, I guess we can take some questions.
Thank you very much, Cindy and Sandra.
You're welcome.
I got a quick question for you. You mentioned the National Center for Home Food Canning. Is that for home food preservation? Is that a good jump off point or starting point if you're looking for recipes and information?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Not only that, their recipe book, what is it? Home canning, home food preservation. Do you have it?
Okay. See this? So easy to preserve.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is the one that we're hoping, we were told at the conference that they're updating.
Right. But the USDA guide to home food preservation is actually available as a PDF online.
Yeah.
Really long one, but you can look for it. You can also order the book if you'd rather have it in a book, but it's a great first place to start.
Okay.
And
appreciate it.
Yeah, and I went to that website to update that slide, and the link, it sends you back to the National Center for Home Food Preservation to get that USDA document.
Okay.
That's on that slide. Yeah.
Hey, Sandra, there was a question from Tony. She was looking to get information on testing the dial gauge. Is your office a place that does that?
Yes. All she needs to do, is she local? Anybody.
She's in Essex County.
Well, yeah, you can come if you want to make the trek down. It depends on what canner. If she has a Presto canner, I can do it. She can if that's too far for her, she can also send the gauge back to Presto. They will do consumer gauge testing. But she's welcome to just email me. I think I have my email on the first slide, and we can set up an appointment if she wants to come down and I can test it for her.
Okay, I'll include your contact information in the follow-up.
Yeah, I want to ask her about the type of canner she has and the age of it.
Okay.
Yep.
Sandra, you and I were discussing about in-person classes. We had another question about that, so maybe you could briefly just explain what we discussed.
Well, it's setting up, unfortunately, the easiest part about doing a hands-on class is if you have your own kitchen in your cooperative extension office and, you can prep in advance and then have the class there. It's a real time saver, but to do a remote class where I would have to travel to another location in the state, that's like a little bit of a larger logistical issue. I would, because of the length of time that we were just talking about that pressure canning requires, I would recommend, and I have traveled to do remote classes in other counties, but it's been for the water bath method because we can find a short processing time and we can do education and we can all do the process together. So that is, I would work with another county extension location that has a suitable kitchen, and that would take some discussion. But I'm open to it. I've done it. I've done 3 or 4 this year.
We'll try to figure that out.
Mhm.
We've got another question for you. Is it possible, common, or recommended to can eggs, whether scrambled or whole?
Okay, that's actually a fairly common question. You can pickle eggs, and that is water bath canning. If you pressure can eggs, you're cooking them for so long that if they are whole, they will turn out like a super ball. They will be a hard rubber substance. So there's nothing edible about it. If you scramble them first, they will be mush because you'd have to add liquid to it. So the quality is really the issue with canning eggs. Drying eggs and freezing are really the 2 recommended processes. There's a lot being said right now about glassing eggs, where you keep them whole. That is not a USDA safe approved way to do it, but I know that it's happening a lot. So I wouldn't can an egg, no, unless it was a pickled egg.
Sandra, you had mentioned to me that you were down with the Lenape tribe.
Yes.
Education on canning. I just wanted to mention that Twyla in the chat wanted to thank you for a great canning class here today. She's part of a Native American community as well in New Jersey, and just appreciated the nostalgia of the presentation.
Well, it was a wonderful experience for me. I have to say, I loved the whole, we had the most beautiful day. It was a perfect fall day. It was a long ride, but the welcome was fantastic. The group was fantastic. And I learned so much about their tribe, their members. It was really a great mutual education experience.
Well, Cindy, Sandra, I really appreciate your time today. The dynamic between the 2 of you is awesome. You should do this again.
Cindy has to unretire.
I am sure you're going to get many views on this one also.
Well, and I don't mind taking questions if people want to send me questions. Sandra's got my contact information.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes. It was really a great experience for us to work together this way.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.